Rainer Maria Rilke was an Austrian poet and novelist. He was born in 1875 and died in 1926 at the age of 51. He wrote one novel, several collections of poetry, and a lot of letters. He spent most of his life in Switzerland, and though he published a little bit in French, most of what he published was in German. This novel of Rilke that I read, called The Notebooks of Malte Laurids Brigge and published in 1910, is the only Rilke that I've read so far. The novel is apparently semi-autobiographical and reads much more like a notebook than like a novel. There's not an obvious plot, and it's really easier to make sense of it if you think of it as a collection of related prose poems than as a novel. And reading Rilke was very interesting because while you're reading it, it's sometimes hard to know exactly what he's talking about, though mostly not. It's mostly tethered to some kind of personal experience or thought, and sometimes it floats away a little, but not for long. I found reading this relatively short novel with no obvious plot surprisingly engaging. While you're reading it, you really feel like you're reading somebody's notebook or their private thoughts, or that they're speaking to you about something that happened to them, which is impressive because this is in translation. And though translation is, of course, very valuable, it does have its limits. And one thing that's often lost in translation is a kind of personal proximity. And the fact that that closeness still comes through, I think, reflects Rilke's power and skill. But what's interesting is that though while I was reading this book, I felt engaged and interested, when I would set it down to go do something else for a while and try to reflect on it, I sometimes couldn't remember any of the things that I liked about it. What's captivating about his writing is kind of hard to grasp. It's kind of misty or dreamlike, or as we'll see, nightmarish. And on the one hand, you could say that it's very realistic, very realist as a novel, precisely because it doesn't seem like a novel. It seems like a notebook. And that's the title of it. These are notebooks. Notebooks don't have a plot. They're often a collection of disconnected thoughts. The only thing I might say is that a true notebook often has sudden shifts that I didn't see in this novel. Not that his goal was to create a truly realistic imitation of somebody's notebook, but when I'm sometimes looking over my notes, I'll have some thought that I had about something, followed by a list of things I have to do, followed by a phone number that I'm going to call, followed by another thought about something else. And that's because you write something and then you go do something else for a while, and then when you come back, you're dealing with something totally different. And on the one hand, doing something like that with a novel might make it easier to put some kind of a plot into it. It would be a sort of epistolary novel, but that definitely would have interrupted this strange and mysterious atmosphere that Rilke created in his novel. As context, you really only need to know that the narrator is a indigent poet living in Paris. And the book opens as follows. Quote, "Here, then, is where people come to live. I'd have thought it more a place to die in." End quote. I'm surprised that I lived in big cities for so long, and I've read and heard so much of people grumbling about life in big cities, and I'd never heard that one. Later he says, quote, "I'm learning to see. I don't know what it's about, but everything is registering in me at a deeper level and doesn't stop where it used to. There's a place within me that I wasn't aware of. What's going on there, I don't know." Skipping ahead a little. "I'm definitely not going to write any more letters. What's the point of telling anyone that I'm changing? I haven't remained who I was. I'm different from who I was before. So clearly, I have no friends or acquaintances. And writing to strangers, to people who don't know me, is simply not possible. Did I say it before? I'm learning to see. Yes, I'm making a start. I'm still not good at it. But I want to make the most of my time. For example, I've never actually wondered how many faces there are. There are a great many people, but there are even more faces, because each person has several." End quote. And to give an example of some of the stranger images that appear in the book, quote, "Out of fright, the woman reared up too quickly, too violently, so that her face was left in her two hands. I could see it lying there, the hollowness of its shape. It cost me an indescribable effort to keep looking at those hands and not at what they'd torn away from. I dreaded seeing the inside of a face, but I was much more afraid of the exposed rawness of the head without a face. I'm afraid. One has to do something about fear once one has it." End quote. The narrator reflects a lot on his childhood, and images like that show how the book blurs the line between reality and imagination. Later he says, quote, "This excellent hotel is very old. In the days of King Clovis, people were already dying here in what few beds there were. Now there are 559 beds to die in. It's natural mass production. With such a high number as that, a single death doesn't get the same attention. However, that isn't what matters. Quantity is what matters. Who today still cares whether or not a death has been well put together? Nobody. Even the rich, who, after all, can afford to attend to the details of dying, are starting to grow slipshod and apathetic. The desire to have a death all of one's own is becoming more and more infrequent. Only a while and it'll become as rare as a life of one's own. God, it's all there. God, it's all there waiting for us. We come along, we find a life ready-made off the peg, and all we have to do is put it on." End quote. I'm really cautious to say very much about these because they really stand on their own, and I think by saying very much I'll just disturb what they create. Though I do have one comment here. You might remember from when we looked at Rameau's nephew, there was a story about how that manuscript was discovered 100 years later in one of the secondhand bookshops that line the Seine River. And I'm not sure, but here might also be a description of the same booksellers, since he's in Paris and talking about booksellers next to the quay, to the dock, though with a garnish of something mystical or transcendental added in. Quote, "Nothing is negligible or superfluous. The booksellers along the quay open up their cases, and the new or worn yellow of the books, the violet brown of the volumes, the larger green of a folder, all are attuned to one another, are valid, are part of the whole, and form a completeness which lacks nothing." End quote. Talking about poetry, of which Rilke, of course, wrote a lot, he writes, quote, "Poems written early in life don't amount to much. One should wait and gather meaning and sweetness a whole life long, and as long a life as possible. And then, at the very end, one might possibly write 10 lines that are any good. For poems aren't, as people think, feelings. One has those early enough. They're experiences. To write a single line of verse, one must see many cities, people, things. One must know animals. One must feel birds flying and know the movements flowers make as they open up in the morning. One must be able to think back to roads in unfamiliar regions, unexpected encounters, and partings which one saw coming long before. One must be able to think back to those days in one's childhood that are still unexplained, to one's parents whom one could not help offending when they brought a delightful gift and one didn't appreciate it. It was a delight for someone else. To those childhood illnesses which arose so peculiarly and with so many profound and difficult changes. To those days in peaceful and secluded rooms, and to those mornings by the sea anywhere, to seas, to nights of travel that swept along high above, flying with the stars. And it's still not enough, even when one's allowed to think of everything one can." End quote. I get this sentiment that in order to write certain things, you have to have experienced certain things, and that writing is to a great extent recording experience. I've come to find that reading requires some experience as well. Sometimes I'm reading a book and I'm thinking, oh man, I should have read this 10 years ago. Except that if I had, I probably wouldn't understand it the same way that I understand it now. It's of course good that they assign Brave New World in 1984 in high school because a lot of people won't reread it later. So it's good to at least assign it once so that people have some general understanding of certain books. But those two and many others are books that had I read them in high school, I wouldn't have understood them properly and it would be worth it to read them again. And I sometimes wonder if there are books that I'm reading now that if I were to read them again 20 years from now, I would view them differently. That's probably true also. But what Rilke is getting at here is the need for experience in order to write. And I think that's definitely true. When you look at a lot of the fiction that comes out of the publishing industry, a lot of the fantasy, a lot of the sci-fi, that kind of writing is not really about trying to get at the marrow of life, trying to recreate very human experiences. It's doing something a little different. In the case of fantasy writing, it's creating a world for a reader to explore. In the case of sci-fi, it's at best thinking about the future, about technology, hypothesizing about what that might be like. And to do those two things doesn't really require what Rilke is talking about here. But I get why he says that. He's talking about the kind of writing maybe that he does, which is about identifying very subtle aspects of human life and recording them. And in that short passage, he was talking about what's required to do that. Though I would throw in that all throughout that earlier period, while you're having those experiences, if you wanted to be a poet, you need to still be writing anyway, because there are loads of people who have had a lot of interesting experiences, and that by itself doesn't let you write poetry, because poetry also involves the technical knowledge of how to use words well, how to think about rhythm, how to pair them together in an interesting way, having a deep library of words to draw on. You need all of this too, so that you've had all this experience, then you also have the literary ability, verbal ability to articulate it well. Also, I'm cautious about encouraging this kind of delaying. First of all, because you don't know how long you're going to live. So you might say, well, I'm going to do that later, and you never get to it. But also, this can be a way of hiding from something that you're sort of afraid to do. You say, well, I'll do that later. First, I have to do all this. And sometimes that's valid. Sometimes people can try much too early to be doing something that first they have to learn a bunch of other things before they should do that last thing. But also, sometimes you can be totally ready for something and you're letting yourself avoid doing it for some other reason, not because there's actually something you need to do first. And knowing which situation you're in requires some honest reflection on your situation. This next passage is a little bit longer. Quote, "It's ludicrous. Here I sit in my little room, I, Brigge, 28 years of age and known to no one. I sit here and am nothing. Nevertheless, this nothing, 5 flights up on a gray Paris afternoon, begins to think, and it has these thoughts. Is it possible, it thinks, that one still hasn't seen or recognized or said anything that's real and important? Is it possible that there have been thousands of years in which to look, to reflect, and to record, and that these thousands of years have been allowed to go by like a school break when one eats a sandwich and an apple? Yes. It's possible. Is it possible that despite inventions and advances, despite culture, religion, and worldly wisdom, one has remained on the surface of life? Is it possible that even this surface, which at any rate might after all have been something, has been covered over with unbelievably boring material so that it has the look of drawing room furniture in the summer holidays? Yes, it's possible. Is it possible that the whole of world history has been misunderstood? Is it possible that the past is false because it's always its masses that have been spoken about, as if one were talking of a convergence of many persons instead of talking about the one person they were gathered round because he was a stranger and was dying? Yes, it's possible. Is it possible that one believed one had to catch up on what had occurred before one was born? Is it possible that each and every person had to remember that he had been produced by all that had gone before, and therefore knew it, and would not let himself be persuaded by others who knew otherwise? Yes, it's possible. Is it possible that all these people have a totally accurate knowledge of what has never been? Is it possible that realities are as nothing to them, that their life is draining away, connected with nothing, like a clock in an empty room? Yes, it's possible." End quote. And then, skipping ahead a bit, quote, "If all this is possible, and if even there's only a glimmer of possibility, then for pity's sake, surely something needs to be done. The first person to come forward who had these disquieting thoughts must begin to do what has always been missed. He could be just anyone, and it doesn't matter in the least if he's not the most suitable person. There's simply no one else to do it. This young, insignificant foreigner will have to sit himself down 5 flights up and write day and night. Yes, he will have to write. That's what it amounts to." End quote. I really love those earlier lines about history in that passage. And then after he says, if all this is true, then what's to be done about it? Then somebody who notices it, even if he's not the best man for the job, just needs to sit down and start writing about it. And in the 21st century, writing has been placed in a secondary or tertiary position of ways to acquire knowledge about something. To sit and contemplate a subject and to write about what you think is not seen in this environment that really emphasizes STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. What Rilke is describing here is seen as a bit foreign. He says, there's something we've missed in history. We haven't really gotten into it, or we haven't even really gotten below the surface of what it is to be human. And I've noticed this, and there's no one else in a position to address it. And so I'm going to start writing about it and try to address it. For the way that most people think about knowledge in the 21st century, that doesn't seem like a good way to acquire knowledge. And of course, you have to be very careful, because sitting and contemplating is an excellent way to deceive yourself, because there's nothing tethering you to reality. There's nothing that has you hooked into what evidence and experimentation will hold to. You can very easily be writing along and everything is true, and then suddenly you get off track and you're writing a bunch of things that aren't true, and it doesn't feel significantly different. It doesn't, for example, feel good when you're writing what's true and kind of hurt when you're writing what's not true. We don't have an evolved sense of pain and pleasure for truth, unfortunately. It would be really useful if we did. We have a tiny bit of a sense of when someone is lying. If you pay close attention, sometimes you can kind of tell if somebody's lying to you. But of course, even that is not always true. It's very easy for people to lie to each other. But we definitely have pretty much no sense of when we're lying to ourselves. So to sit and write about something is risky, because you could very easily get yourself onto a trail of thought that does not track with anything in reality. Now, all of that being said, this little book of Rilke is very interesting, and it accesses some things that I think are true in human life, if only because they reflect a certain kind of experience. They don't necessarily articulate some universal truth, though you could argue that it does that also. And the only way that he does that, and arguably the only way that he could possibly do that, is by sitting and thinking and writing, thinking about what he's experienced and trying to use this collection of symbols. Written words are symbols for spoken words, which are symbols for phenomena, trying to use words to recreate that experience in the minds of other people. So you could argue that the concern that we have misunderstood history in some foundational way, to say that sentence is just an abstract collection of words that doesn't have any ultimate meaning. But if you don't think that, if you think that sentence could be reflecting something true, even just that that's possible, then having some guy sitting up in a garret in Paris writing is a reasonable way to try to get at what might have been missed there, especially if it's somebody like Rilke, who apparently devoted some energy to trying to spiritually get below the surface of certain things. Later, he's talking about a house that he visited when he was younger. He went there with his dad after his mother had passed away. It was his mom's dad's house. Quote, "I don't know what prompted him to go visit his father-in-law. The two men had not seen each other for years, ever since my mother died, and my father had never himself set foot inside the old manor house to which Count Brahe had retired late in life. I never saw this remarkable house again, because when my grandfather died, it passed into strangers' hands. Thus, seeing it now, in a version of my childhood memories, it's not a building, rather it's all split up, a room here, a room there, and here a section of passageway that doesn't link these two rooms, but has simply been preserved, a fragment. Similarly, it's all scattered about within me. The rooms, the staircase which opened onto the ground floor with such great elaborateness, and other narrow circular stairways in whose darkness one traveled like blood through veins. The tower rooms, the high balconies, the unexpected galleries one was urged along from the little entrance floor, all that is still within me, and will never cease being within me. It's as if the image of this house had plunged into me from an infinite height and smashed to pieces on the foundation of my being." End quote. One of the things that I found very effective in this book was not just the descriptions of his childhood, but the descriptions of the memories of his childhood. He's able to talk about what the memories are like in his mind. Here he's talking about how he remembers this house, but he remembers it in pieces. He can't quite remember how all of it fits together, but he has these vivid images, and also he'll always have those images. And I love that thing at the end about the house plunged from an infinite height and smashed to pieces on the foundation of my being. That's great as well. But I think most people have memories that are like this in some way. For everybody, it's not a grand, elaborate manor house as it was for him. But we have memories, or arguably all of our memories from childhood, are kind of like this memory of this manor house where we can remember pieces of it, but we can't remember the whole thing all put together as a unity. And this accurate, subjective description, not only of what he remembered, but of remembering, is very interesting. In another passage, he's reading in the National Library of France, and he gives a nice description of that feeling of reading in a library. But if you go and look up some pictures of the National Library in France, you'll notice that there's a second reason why he had this nice feeling, and it wasn't just because of the readers around him. It's a very impressive space. Quote, "I'm sitting here reading a poet. There are a great number of people in the room, but one doesn't notice them. They're inside the books. Sometimes they move about in the pages like people turning over in their sleep between two dreams. How good it is being among people who are reading. Why aren't they always like this? You can go up to one of them and gently touch him. He doesn't feel a thing. And if, when you stand up, you bump against someone next to you and you apologize, he gives a nod towards where he hears your voice coming from. His face turns towards you and he doesn't see you, and his hair is like the hair of someone asleep. How good that feels. And I'm sitting here, and I have a poet. What a fate." End quote. And looking at some photos of the National Library of France and thinking about it a little bit made me realize there is a special feeling in being in a big room with a lot of people who are also reading quietly. I've never been to that library, but in getting my bachelor's degree, I was lucky enough to have access to a library with a fairly big reading room. And it's a nice feeling to see a whole lot of people all reading different things, and everybody's very quiet, and everybody's lost in what they're reading. Though I have to admit, you find fewer people, I think because of technology, because of cell phones and computers, who really fall into what they're reading the way that he talks about. That their hair can get messed up and they don't even notice, and they look at you but they're barely looking at you. That takes a level of disconnection from life, an ability to really get lost in what you're reading that is not possible if your phone can interrupt you at any moment. Your mind just won't let go of your surroundings if you have in your mind that I have to have access to my phone in case somebody texts me about something useless. And of course, such a nice reading space is not required. It's a luxury, but it's nice if you've experienced it. Here's another passage with something interesting. Quote, "While the warm and squishy babbling continued on the other side, there, for the first time in many, many years, it was there again. That, the big thing, which had shocked me with my first deep horror when I was a child, lying in bed with a fever. Yes, that's what I had always called it, whenever they were all standing around my bed feeling my pulse and asking me what had scared me. The big thing. And whenever they sent for the doctor and he came and persuaded me to tell him, I would simply beg him to do everything he could so that the big thing went away. Nothing else mattered. But he was like the others. He couldn't take it away, though I was small then, and it would have been easy to help me. And now it was here again. Later on, it had simply failed to appear. It hadn't come back, not even during nights when I'd had fever. But it was here now, and I didn't have fever. Now it was here. Now it was growing out of me like a tumor, like a second head, and was a part of me, though it couldn't belong to me since it was so big. It was there like a big dead animal that at one time, when it was still living, had been my hand or my arm. And my blood flowed through me and through it, as through one and the same body. And my heart must have been under a great strain pumping blood into the big one. There was hardly enough blood. And the blood against its own will entered the big thing and came back sick and corrupted. But the big thing swelled and grew before my face like a warm bluish boil, and grew before my mouth, and across my remaining eye ran the edge of its shadow." End quote. So that's a description of a kind of feverish nightmare, or some kind of sleep paralysis maybe, that he had had when he was a kid. But then it came back, and he gives this strange description of how it's now somehow attached to him, and his blood is going into it and out of it. Very weird. And we could try to read some symbolism into that, but it also might just be a description of the kind of weird things that you dream about sometimes. And he talks a bit more about fear. Quote, "I'm lying in my bed 5 flights up, and my day, which nothing interrupts, is like a clock face without hands. Just as a thing that has long been lost is found one morning safe and sound where it belongs, and looking almost newer than it did at the time it went missing, just as if someone had been taking care of it. So here and there on my blanket lie things that were lost in my childhood, and are now like new. All my fears are here once more. The fear that a small woolen thread sticking out of the hem of the blanket may be hard, hard and sharp as a steel needle. The fear that this little button on my nightshirt may be bigger than my head, big and heavy. The fear that this breadcrumb, now falling from my bed, may turn into glass and shatter when it meets the floor. And the oppressive fear that when in reality it does, then everything will be broken into pieces. Everything. Forever. The fear that the margin strip of a torn open letter may be something that's forbidden, that no one should be allowed to see. Something indescribably precious for which there is no place in the room that could be safe enough. The fear that if I were allowed to fall asleep, I might swallow the piece of coal that's lying in front of the stove. The fear that some number may begin to grow in my brain until it has no more room. The fear that what I'm lying on may be granite, gray granite. The fear that I could start screaming and people would flock to my door and eventually break it open. The fear that I could give myself away and tell about all I'm frightened of. And the fear that there's nothing I could say because it's all unsayable. And the other fears. The fears. End quote. Those are all so vivid and specific that I think they have to be things that he thought about himself, at least when he was a kid, if not when he was an adult. And what that passage seems to articulate to me is this sort of strange, irrational, gripping fear that I've only ever experienced in a state between waking and sleeping, or in a dream. In a dream, you can suddenly be afraid of something that doesn't make any sense. You have a feeling that if something very innocuous like a breadcrumb falling off of a bed onto the floor happens, then everything will be ruined forever. And this passage really expresses that very specific feeling very well. It's almost like a photograph of it. But I have this feeling like in order for Rilke to have taken that photograph, he both needed to have gone on the adventure of going to find it. He had to go out into the wilderness of human experience and look for certain things. And then he had to snap the picture. He had to grab it, grab that feeling. And I think that's one of the things that Rilke does extremely well, as we're seeing. These different, very specific aspects of human life, he's able to really show them very vividly. And to be honest, I'm kind of surprised to find so much that I like so much in this book. I was going into this prepared for it to be some weird modernism out of which I couldn't get anything valuable, but it's not that at all. It's a very slim little book that's very interesting. And then he talks about life in the big city. Quote, "I'm in Paris. The ones who hear this are pleased. Most of them envy me. They're right. It's a great city. Great. Full of extraordinary temptations. For myself, I must admit that in certain respects, I've succumbed to these temptations. I don't think there's any other way of saying it. I've succumbed to these temptations, and this has brought about certain changes, if not in my character, then assuredly in my view of the world. At any rate, in my life. Under these influences, a completely different perception of all things has formed in me, and there are now certain differences which, more than has been the case in the past, separate me off from other people. A changed world, a new life full of new meanings. At present, I'm finding it rather difficult, because everything is new. I'm a beginner in my own relationships." End quote. I think we've talked about this on this podcast before, but after having spent 15 years living exclusively in big cities, I now live in a smaller place, and I love it. I love it so much. My wife jokes that whenever we're walking around, I always say, "Man, I love the name of the town that we live in." And I really do. And we're hopefully going to have kids soon. And I've been thinking about what kind of life I would want my kids to have. And right now, I really feel like they could just live their whole lives in this town that we live in, and they would be very happy. And having seen not only a big city, but several different big cities, I feel like I have a sense of what those cities have to offer, and that I could say to my kid, "Look, there's nothing out there. Just stay here." But I've been thinking about whether I really think that or not. For example, do I appreciate where we live just on its own, or because I've seen these other places and I see what's different about them? If I had just been born here and lived here my whole life, would I still think about it the same way? Though I do have to say there are people who have lived here their whole lives and they love it too, and they know what's great about it. So it might not be the contrast, it might be the place itself. And I don't think that this place is unique in that it is truly one of a kind, though maybe it's a little unusual. I think all that it really is a place with an actual community where people know each other and they care about what's going on in each other's lives. And there's few enough people so that your reputation matters. But anyway, I think about, would I want my kid, in order to live a very full life, would I want them to see what city life is like, even just for a few years? Of course, my kid is going to live whatever life fortune lays out for him. But if I could pick his path for him, would I want it to go through a big city? And it's hard to know because, as Rilke says here, there are temptations in a big city, and they can really screw a person up. Though, there are some drugs and bad influences in the town that we live in as well. And more importantly, I think Samuel Johnson got into this, if your virtue is untested, then it's not virtue. If you're only on the straight path because nothing has ever called you off of it, and because you've never imagined anything else, then that's not the same as having resisted those things. Anyway, I'm very interested in this urban-rural divide because a big part of my life recently has been crossing over it for the first time in a while. He then gets into a surreal reflection on Beethoven. Though Beethoven is not named explicitly, his name is given in a footnote in this section. Quote, "The molder of plaster casts, whose shop I pass every day, has hung 2 masks by his door. One is the face of the young woman who had drowned. They had taken a plaster cast of it in the morgue because it was beautiful, because it was smiling, because the smiling was deceptive, as if it knew. And lower down, a man's knowing face. This hard knot of firmly tightened meanings, this relentless, self-intensifying music that tried incessantly to condense and fall to earth. The countenance of him whose hearing a god had sealed, so that there might be no sound but his own, so that he wouldn't be swayed by sounds that were dulling and invalid. He in whom sound was clear and enduring, so that only the toneless senses might bring the world to him, silently, a tense world, waiting, unready for the creation of sound. World perfecter, just as that which falls as rain over the land and upon the waters drops down carelessly and by chance and joyfully, heeding earthly laws, again rises invisibly out of all things and rises and hovers in form the heavens, so our precipitations rose out of you and vaulted the earth with music. Your music. Would that it were about the world, not only about us. Would that a pianoforte had been built for you in the Theban desert, and an angel had led you to that solitary instrument through desert mountain ranges, where lie kings, courtesans, anchorites. He surely would have flung himself upwards out of fear that you would begin, and then you would have poured forth, unheard, giving back to the universe only what the universe can bear. Bedouin out hunting would have galloped by in the distance, superstitiously, but merchants would have flung themselves on the ground at the edges of your music as if you were a storm. Only a few solitary lions would have circled around you at night, afraid of themselves, menaced by their own agitated blood." End quote. So there's a cool image of Beethoven playing a piano out in the middle of the desert. I like that. Later, there's another passage about Ibsen, though Ibsen is not explicitly named. Again, there's a footnote that indicates it. And the passage is really about the corrupting influence of fame on creativity. Quote, "There I sat with your books, obstinate man, and tried to think as others do who don't let you be in one whole but have taken a portion for themselves, one that satisfies them. For I still didn't understand fame, this public destruction of something that's still forming, whose worksite is broken into and stones are chucked about by the mob. Young man, wherever you are, there is something mounting in you that will cause you to shudder. There is advantage in the fact that no one knows you. And if those who think you are nothing contradict you, and if those you kept company with abandon you, and if they want to destroy you on account of your dear thoughts, what is this obvious danger which keeps you strong within compared with the cunning enmity of an approaching fame that will render you harmless by scattering you all around? Ask no one to speak of you, not even contemptuously, and as time goes on and you notice how your name is being spread around, don't take it more seriously than anything else you hear from their mouths. Think, it's become a bad name. Get rid of it, take a different one, any, so that God can call to you in the night, and hide it from everyone. Loneliest and most remote of men, how they have caught up with you by your fame. How long ago is it when they were fundamentally opposed to you, and now they go around with you as if you were like them, and they take your words around with them in the cages of their darkness, and reveal them in public places, and tease them a little out of their safety. All your terrifying beasts of prey. That was the first time I read what you had said, when the words escaped and fell desperately upon me in my desert, as desperate as you yourself were at the end, you whose path is still marked out wrongly on every map." End quote. Later, there's another passage about fear. He's talking about his mother. Quote, "She could suddenly turn towards me, for I'd grown a little bit, and with a smile that required a great effort from her would say, 'What an enormous amount of needles there are, Malta. They are lying around in so many places, And when you think how easily they fall out, she would check herself as if to make a joke of it, but the thought of all the badly fastened needles dropping down anywhere and at any moment shook her with horror." End quote. This is a category of fear that on the one hand, we would probably think of as some kind of a disorder. It's unusual and strange to be afraid of something like how many needles there are and how easily they can fall on the ground and you could step on them. From another angle, this is a valid fear because there are many needles around in the world, though admittedly there are probably far fewer today than there were 110 years ago or so when this was written, and you could easily step on one of them. But something about this kind of fear makes me think it's some kind of more general human anxiety. And the earlier passage about fear seemed similar to me, though those were much more irrational, strange fears. There are fears that are not really about what they seem like they're about. They're about a general anxiety about life. Somebody's generally afraid of what might happen, and that fear takes on a definite shape in the form of some threat that can be articulated. But the origin of the fear is not that expressible form, but a more general, shapeless fear. And this kind of fear about how many needles there are and how careless people are in keeping track of them seems to be in that category of fear. Then later is another passage about his mother. It's about hope. Quote, "Such matters occupied Mama's thoughts when she was alone, and she was always alone during those last years. Of course, I'll never solve it, Malte," she would say sometimes, with her characteristically bold smile that wasn't for anyone to see, its purpose being wholly fulfilled when it was smiled. "But to think that no one ever feels tempted to find out. If I were a man, yes, particularly if I were a man, I would think about it, and in doing so, I would follow proper procedures and keep my thoughts orderly from the beginning. Because there has to be a beginning. If one could only grasp it, it would be something to be going on with. Malte, we pass away like this, and it seems to me that people are all distracted and preoccupied and don't pay proper attention as we go along. It's as if a shooting star were to fall, and no one saw it, and no one made a wish. Never forget to wish for something, Malte. One should never give up wishing. I do not believe there is any kind of fulfillment, but there are wishes that last a long time, a whole lifetime, so that one can't possibly wait long enough for fulfillment." End quote. And on a similar note, quote, "There were times when Mama came and read me fairy stories for half an hour. For proper long readings, there was Severson. But it wasn't on account of the stories. For we agreed that we didn't like fairy stories. We had a different idea about what was wonderful. We found that what we marveled at most was when everything went naturally. We didn't think much of flying through the air. Fairies disappointed us." End quote. These two, if I talk too much about them, I feel like I will be repeating badly what Rilke said. There's a strange passage where he's a little kid and he's trying on costumes. Quote, "That was the time I got to know the influence that can come directly from a particular costume. No sooner had I donned one of them when I was forced to admit that it had me in its power, that it dictated my movements, the expression of my face, everything that came into my mind. My hand, that the lace cuff kept falling across, was definitely not my normal hand. It moved like an actor. I would say it even watched itself moving, however exaggerated that sounds. In the meantime, all this feigning never went so far as to make me feel a stranger to myself. On the contrary, the more variations I gave of myself, the more convinced of myself I became. I grew bolder and bolder." End quote. I'm very cautious about trying to read more into a text than what's there. Rilke here really might just have been remembering something that he experienced when he was a kid. But it made me think of how the different clothing that you wear can make you act a little bit differently. How we wear different costumes, and that affects our perception of ourselves. But then something strange happens. Hot and furious, I dashed in front of the mirror, and with some anxiety on account of the mask, I saw my hands working away. But that's just what the mirror had wanted. Its moment of vengeance had come. While I was straining with an increasing feeling of restriction to somehow squeeze myself out of my disguise, the mirror compelled me. I don't know what with to look up, and it dictated to me an image. No, something real, an alien, incomprehensible, monstrous reality that permeated me against my will. For now it was the stronger of us, and I was the mirror. I stared at this large, terrifying, unknown something, and it seemed incredible that I was alone with it. But at the very moment I thought the worst had happened, my mind emptied. I wasn't there. For a second, I had an indescribable, achingly futile longing for myself, because there was then only him. There was nothing but him." End quote. So he initially was trying to get the mask off and having some trouble. But then he caught sight of himself in the mirror and got even more scared by that. And this is an effective description of a little kid's fear. When a little kid is afraid of something, we usually think of it as something harmless and cute. And you say, oh, don't be scared. It's not a big deal. But at that moment, for that kid, it's as frightening as anything could be for you. In fact, it might be more so because as an adult, you have some anchoring to reality. And if you see something that seems supernatural or whatever, something that seems out of the ordinary, part of your mind is going, oh, I'm just perceiving this the wrong way. Something else is going on. Whereas when you're a kid, you have no guardrails on your imagination. If something seems like a monster, it's definitely a monster, and it's gonna eat you. This reminds me of a passage in Emerson. I don't think we talked about it in the episode about Emerson, but I remember he says something about how a cat chasing its tail. We look at the cat chasing his tail and we say, oh, isn't that nice? But for the cat, there's all kinds of drama and twists and turns in the story of him chasing his tail. It's an epic. And for us from the outside, it looks like a simple thing. And this bit here with this description of a child's fear is sort of similar. We're getting a first-hand account of something that from the outside we usually don't take very seriously. Here's a longer passage about a type of young woman that Rilke must have observed and which certainly still exists today, and maybe is more common today than it was in Rilke's day. And he's talking about tapestries in a museum. Quote, occasionally, though, you'll see young girls in front of the tapestries, for there are lots of young girls in the museums, girls from somewhere or other who have left homes that no longer hold on to anything. They find themselves in front of these tapestries and for a short while forget about themselves. They've always felt that there existed this kind of quiet life whose slowly moving gestures revealed not quite all their significance, and they dimly recall even thinking for a time that such would be their life. Then hurriedly they'd get out a sketchbook and begin to draw whatever presented itself, one of the flowers or a happy little animal. It didn't matter. They'd already been told exactly what they were looking at, and it really doesn't matter. Just keep drawing, that's the main thing. Because it's for this they'd left home one day, rather stormily. They're from good families, but whenever they lift their arm as they're drawing, you can see that their dress isn't buttoned at the back, or at least not all the way. There are a few buttons they can't reach. That's because when the dress was made, there was not yet any talk of their suddenly leaving home alone. In families, you always find there's someone who sees to buttons like these. But here, dear God, who would waste their time doing that in such a big city? You'd need a friend, but friends are all in the same boat, and what it comes down to is buttoning up each other's dress, which is ridiculous and reminds you of your family, and that's what you don't want. Now and then, while they're drawing, they can't avoid thinking whether or not it might have been possible, after all, to remain at home. If one could only have been religious, devoted, in step with the rest. But it would look foolish to be trying to be the same as everyone else. It would look foolish. The path has somehow become narrower. Families are no longer able to turn to God. What remains is only various alternative ways, if need be, in which to share things. But what happened when sharing was honest was that each individual received so little it was a disgrace. And if there was cheating in the sharing out, quarrels broke out. No, it's better to draw whatever you're drawing. In time you'll achieve a likeness. And with art, if you take it bit by bit, the result will be really quite enviable. And so, putting all their effort into the task they have set themselves, these young girls forego any longer view. They don't notice how in everything they draw they are doing nothing other than suppressing inside themselves the immutable life that in these woven pictures radiantly opens up before them. They are not willing to believe it. Now, when so much is changing, they too want to change. They're very close to giving up on themselves, and to thinking about themselves in the way that men might speak of them in their absence. This seems progress to them. Already they're almost persuaded that you search for one pleasure, and then another, and then an even greater one, that life consists in this, if you don't want to lose it through some kind of silliness. They've already begun to look around, to search. They whose strength has always resided in being found. That, I believe, is a result of being tired. For untold centuries they have seen to the whole business of love. They have played the entire dialogue, both parts, for the man has simply repeated the words badly. And he has made their shared learning difficult with his distractedness, with his thoughtlessness, with his jealousy, which itself was a kind of thoughtlessness. On the other hand, women have persevered day and night and have increased their love and their misery. And from among them, under the pressure of endless needs, have arisen women powerful in their love who, even while they called out for the man, had surpassed him and outgrew him when he did not return." End quote. First, he's talking about a kind of woman who leaves home to go study art, and in those days, that was a very uncommon thing to do. And she faces urban life where you don't have family, and your friends don't want to button up your dress. And when the dress was made, it had never even been imagined that a woman would live without her family. And then the discussion of romantic love and how women have always been the leaders in that. Anyway, I have nothing to add, but it's an effective passage. Here's another good one. Quote, "For a while now, I have believed that it is our power, the whole of our power, that is too strong for us. It's true that we don't know it, but don't we know least what is rightly our own? Sometimes I think about how heaven came to be, and how death, because we've distanced ourselves from what is most valuable to us, because there were so many other things to do first, and because we were too busy to safeguard it. The passage of time has now obscured this, and we have grown accustomed to lesser things. We no longer recognize what is ours, and we are appalled by its sheer magnitude." End quote. Later, he's talking about death, and he mentions a French poet and playwright named Félix Arvert. He writes, quote, "Can't you imagine, for example, someone copying out for themselves an account of how Félix Arvert died? It was in a hospital. He was dying gently and composed, and the nun perhaps thought that he was further along his last journey than he was. In a very loud voice, she called out some instruction or other as to where they could find this and that. She was a somewhat uneducated nun. She had never seen the word corridor written, but she couldn't avoid using it at that moment. Thus it happened that she said collidor, thinking it was the way you said it. Whereupon Arvert postponed his dying. It seemed to him necessary that the matter be cleared up first. He became completely lucid and set her right. The word is corridor. Then he died. He was a poet and hated approximates. Or perhaps to him it had to do with truth. Or maybe it bothered him to be taking with him as a last impression that of a world continuing on its way so carelessly. One can no longer say, but one shouldn't mistake it for pedantry." End quote. So as this poet, Félix Arvert, was at the edge of death, he heard the nun mispronounce a word, and he had to come back and correct her, and then he died. That's a good way to go to, Félix Arvert. Later, Rilke writes, quote, "I could easily write the history of my neighbors. It would take a whole lifetime. Admittedly, it would be more the history of the symptoms that they have produced in me. But what they share with all such beings is that they can be detected only in the disturbances they give rise to in certain tissues." End quote. Now there's an interesting thought. Everybody, you, me, everybody, we can all be detected only in the disturbances to which we give rise in certain tissues. You affect the eye, you affect the ear, you affect someone's sense of touch. That's the only way that you're knowable. That's an interesting thought. Even if you talk to someone and try to represent your innermost soul to them, you're then only affecting a disturbance in their ear and then in their brain. It's interesting that Rilke is sometimes described as exploring the subjective, exploring the first-person view of the world, and he certainly does that. But this thought is extremely objective, more objective than most people are ever, to notice that your impact on people is just wiggling their tissues in one way or another. And their impact on you is the same thing. That's what it is objectively, outside of human experience. And then there's an interesting line about time. Quote, "As he sat there in the dark room with his eyes wide open, he began to understand that what he was feeling now was real time passing. He actually recognized all these seconds, all tepid, uniform, but fast, fast. Heaven only knew what they still intended to do." End quote. And then there's a short passage about how society turns against people. Quote, "Where you have someone who pulls himself together, for example, a solitary person, who wants to be wholly content in himself day and night, it immediately provokes the opposition, the scorn, and the hatred of those degenerate items which in bad conscience can no longer bear to think that something can actually keep itself together and strive to follow its own significance. They join forces in order to cause trouble, to frighten, to mislead, and they know that they can do it. Winking to one another, they begin their seduction, which then grows to immeasurable proportions and carries along with it all creatures and even God himself against the solitary one, the one who will perhaps survive, the saint." End quote. Those are the passages that I wanted to read from the notebooks of Malte Laurids Brigge, or Brugge, I think it's pronounced, by Rilke. Even just having read this one novel of his, I already feel better prepared to read some of his poetry, and I'm sure that if I read this novel again, I would get a lot more out of it, because he really writes in his own style, and it takes a little while to just get used to that style, and to thereafter understand what he's saying without getting lost in his accent, his style. Reading a book like this helps you to get out of your expectations of the kind of thing that you're going to find when you look between the covers of a book. If you're reading The Red and the Black, it's a little bit more what you expect to find. It's a story, there's characters, there's some things to think about, there's some morals, There's some descriptions, and that's what it is. That's the typical novel form. Whereas, if nothing else, and I think Rilke is a lot more than this, but at base, something that Rilke does is show us that what goes on between two covers of a book can be something very different from what is typically done. And I think this is a good example of what is sometimes called modernist literature or modern literature. I think a lot of what happened in the 20th century that is described as modern literature is not useful, but I think this was really good. And if one of the functions of a book is to expand your mind, is to push further the fence that encloses all the things you've ever thought about, or the types of things that you've thought about, or the ways in which you have thought about them, then Rilke definitely helps to pull up the posts of that fence and push it a bit further away. I was also surprised by how fear-producing some of this writing was. Rilke is obviously not thought of as a horror writer, and he's not writing about death or existential dread or something like that, but he writes very effectively about fear. Some of the passages in this book put a chill up my spine much more effectively than certainly most and maybe any horror movie that I've seen. And what's strange about it is that it's not easy to explain why. Anyway, I enjoyed looking at this book. I hope you did too. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, I hope you'll go to my website, vollrathpublishing.com, VOLLRATH publishing.com, and pick up a copy of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley for yourself if you haven't read it, or for your friends and family if you have. They absolutely should read it too. If they're interested in classic literature, it's a great read. If they've never read any classic literature before, it's a great entrance into old books. It's very action-packed. It's got a lot to think about, a lot to talk about, especially given the way that artificial intelligence, or something that goes by that name, has kicked in the door of public life here in 2023. I've prepared an excellent edition. I'm very proud of it. It's got original cover art, 97 footnotes that explain some of the more unusual vocabulary that Mary Shelley uses. The print quality is very good. I've got it at a good price, free shipping. I hope you'll go and get yourself a copy right now. And farewell until next time. Take care and happy reading.